Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody to the science show Science Connections, which will be broadcasted by the Muslim TV network. This is a show that explores nature through science all around us, from quarks to galaxies and everything in between. We will depend on our innate curiosity to ask critical questions that lead to even more critical questions. And in this journey, we'll embark on trials and triumphs and probably will fail more than we will succeed, all in the effort to create a better life for humanity, to live in harmony with the universe around us. In each episode, we're going to meet with a scientist and ask them to share with us their scientific discovery, and then to tell us their story, how they became scientists, how did they get into science, and to, on this roller coaster journey of discovery, how they encounter challenges and how they deal with those challenges, and then to tell us how their scientific discoveries actually have an impact on our everyday life in more ways than we can imagine. Today's episode is a conversation with Professor Mohammad Zaman, who is a professor of biomedical engineering at the Boston University. And he has a wonderful, amazing book called The Epic Battle Between People and Pathogens, Biography of Resistance. I advise you all to get the book. It's amazing. It's a wonderful read and very, very inspiring. And I'm sure he'll tell us more about it in this interview. Welcome, Professor Zaman.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Dajani. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Great. So we want to know about your story. What got you into science in the first place? What piqued your curiosity?
So I come from a family of social scientists and historians. My father, my mother, my brother. I was the first one. So my sister is a doctor, but I was the first one in the family who thought that he wanted to study science as a discipline. So I grew up in Pakistan, and like many other places in the world, the options were to either become an engineer or a doctor. And I was just not interested. So I remember very clearly I was in 6th or 7th grade, and I had a little sort of a laboratory underneath this staircase that we had. And eventually that laboratory grew and moved under my bed. And I had little test tubes, and my mother was very encouraging, and I would mix things and I would just find them fascinating. Around the same time, I got a hand on a couple of books of people who were making elements, right? So this was just completely shocking. I mean, how can you make elements? Nature makes elements. I mean, what do you mean? And this was sort of about sort of the man-made elements in the actinide series in the periodic table. And that just got me so fascinated and interested that you could create something like that, something that's an element that has never been done in nature, and you can do that. And that sense of curiosity about making things has always been there. So as I went through my 8th, 9th, 10th grade and so on, I got more and more interested and fascinated by how things work. Now, some people have the same fascination and get interested in making engines or making sort of devices. I got interested in how nature makes things and got really interested in chemistry of how things come together. One of the things I remember very clearly when I was very young was sort of just this fascination that how could it be that both carbon and oxygen sort of support combustion and burning, and carbon dioxide doesn't? And that was just sort of blew my mind as to you could make things and they would become something completely different. And so I continued on that journey. I was very fortunate to have a mother who was very, very supportive. My father died when I was very young. I was 10. And she just sort of let me do what I wanted to do. We were strictly middle class, and this was just a fascinating time to be experimenting with everything that was around me. I remember at one point doing this experiment where I wanted to dissolve paper in water, and I just couldn't come to terms. How is it that paper doesn't dissolve? And I tried so hard. I warmed it up, I cooled it down, and it just wouldn't dissolve. So there were all kinds of these things that I was just curious about, and sort of that allowed me to be try to come to terms with what the world around me was, and how I sort of I was trying to navigate that.
That's amazing. I mean, what you shared about the role of your mother in encouraging you to do these, I want to say, crazy experiments that came out of crazy questions. about can you dissolve paper in water, or tinkering, like you said, under your bed. So that you're very lucky to have such a supportive mother to inspire you to go beyond. And I think also the way you've described the magic of nature, of how things can come out of nothing, right? Which is like kind of alchemy. And I think it's about exploring nature and understanding those laws is what makes us understand the magic. It doesn't rob us from the magic. The magic is always there, but it makes us understand it, and then to think how I can utilize it to make my life and the life of humanity better. So that very harmonized relationship with nature, which I think is also a part of our culture, is that nature is not considered as the enemy that I want to control, but actually nature is something I want to, we work in harmony together, which I think I'd love to hear more about you, about your work later on as you then progressed in your scientific career, and how did that play out in your work?
Well, you mentioned a couple of things, Dr. Dajani. The first thing is about my mother, and I think I just cannot emphasize that enough. She was not actually a scientist by training, but she was just there to support. And I think for the people who will see this show, I think the role of the parents, the role of the elders, cannot be overstated. That is just absolutely true. She was very supportive. I remember in summer breaks, she would tell me to teach her from the chemistry book I had in 9th grade. And even though she probably knew that material, but it was sort of just encouraging me. I remember very early on sort of getting this book in Urdu about sort of the famous Muslim scientist, and the one who fascinated me most was Jabir ibn Hayyan. And I was troubled by the fact that maybe, and because my knowledge at that time was so little, maybe you could convert lead into gold. And as I sort of learned more about sort of the actinide series and sort of these human-made elements, I thought, well, maybe if you bombarded it with enough neutrons and protons, electrons, maybe lead would become gold. So maybe alchemists were onto something. So this was sort of the part of the process that allowed me to ask questions, and even questions that were, I would say, in hindsight, were nonsense, were just really, really good in terms of allowing me to sort of develop this fascination with science and with chemistry.
Wow, that's amazing. So tell us more about what happened. I mean, how did that initial interest and curiosity in science during your teenage years blossom to the scientist you are today?
Yeah, so I started off at an engineering institution in Pakistan after I finished my 12th grade. And at that time, there was very little capacity in the national system to accept students who were not interested in engineering or medicine. I was not. I did very well, alhamdulillah, in my sort of, there was a 12th grade exam. I did very well in that. And I went to the engineering school, and I ended up sort of being bored and perhaps frustrated. At the same time, my elder brother, who's the eldest in the family, I'm the youngest in the family, was abroad doing his PhD. And he encouraged me to apply for undergraduate studies abroad. And I didn't even know, actually, that you could do that, because he had done his master's and was studying sort of history in Canada. So I came to the US. My mother, who was a single mother, couldn't afford sort of the tuition. So I ended up going to places where the tuition was low and I was on a scholarship. But I maintained this interest in science and curiosity. I had great teachers. I went from undergraduate, and I tell my family and my students, I never had a job. I started at a university and never sort of left it. So I went from my undergraduate, and then I got even more interested in chemistry, and very sort of I would say, a niche area of chemistry at that time, which still is a smaller area of theoretical chemistry. I was interested in mathematics, I was interested in physics, and I was interested in chemistry. So I ended up looking at programs for PhD, which were what are called theoretical chemistry, where sort of math, physics, and chemistry intersect. Where instead of doing things in the lab, which I still was very interested in, I was going to do things on a computer, sort of looking at the marvels of molecules and proteins. And I applied to a bunch of programs, and I started my sort of PhD program in one of the best theoretical chemistry programs in the country, University of Chicago. I again was very fortunate to have mentors who allowed me to think and ask crazy questions and challenge it. I remember very clearly before I started my PhD program, I was interested in chaos theory, right? So chaos theory is a branch of physics or mathematical physics that looks at sort of perturbations and chaos. And here was this person. His name was Professor Leo Kadanoff. And he was sort of a world-renowned chaos theory person at University of Chicago. He looked like Santa Claus, right? So big, bushy beard, white, elderly guy. And I said, well, I want to do a summer project with him. And he asked me, what did I know about chaos theory? And I didn't. And the only thing I knew was what I had seen in Jurassic Park. This character in Jurassic Park, his name was Ian Malcolm, who said, well, even small perturbations, small changes in the Jurassic Park would lead to disturbance and destruction of the park. And that's all I knew. And Leo was fascinated. I had not taken any course in chaos theory or any of that. He said, that sounds pretty good. So I've had all kinds of these crazy experiences, but people have been there to say, well, that sounds good enough. Let's figure it out. What is it that we know? What is it that we don't know? And so I cannot thank my mentors enough who've been there in sort of holding my hand and sort of guiding me in my sort of crazy questions. And I hope I can do the same for the students who work with me.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, one recurring thing I'm hearing from what you're sharing with us is the importance of, in addition to curiosity and not being shy, to ask any question and to share your interest, even though you haven't read a lot about it. And I think that raw curiosity shines through for people to recognize that this person is really, really inspired and motivated to, and has a passion to explore the world around them. But also, you also talk about reading, whether as a teenager or now about the chaos theory. I remember growing up reading James Glegg's Chaos, the book, exactly. Right? That inspired the general public about the fundamental aspect of randomness in nature and how we can explain a lot of the phenomena as a result of that.
Absolutely.
No, this is amazing. So tell us more about how did you become a biomedical engineer, since you were interested in the more fundamental basic sciences of chemistry, physics, and math. And by the way, sometimes we think these disciplines are siloed and each one is separate, but we all know today that they're all woven together, that one doesn't make sense without the other.
So the secret here, Dr. Dajani, is that I don't have any degrees in either biology or in engineering. And while somebody might say, oh, this is crazy, but this is exactly the nature of science. So after I finished my PhD, I ended up going to MIT for my postdoc. And I worked again with people who were remarkably kind and generous with their time. And it turned out that their home department was biomedical engineering. Or bioengineering in that case, because that was the MIT department was called. Towards the end of my PhD, I got interested in, so I was working on proteins. I was interested in asking questions of why proteins have a particular structure and shape, and how does that affect their function. And towards the end of my PhD, I was interested in looking at things that were even more complex, more larger in scale, right? So I was interested in cellular systems. So again, the same thing, right? So I ended up in a postdoc, and my postdoc advisors want me to do microscopy. Now, I had never used a microscope in my life, and they took a chance on me, and they knew that I was being honest, that I was going to work hard, and I was curious. And their home department was bioengineering. So oftentimes in a U.S. academic system, what ends up happening is that the job that you end up with in academia is not necessarily the degree that you have in PhD, but what you have research experience in. And bioengineering or biomedical engineering was and continues to be sort of this intersection of various kinds of different disciplines coming together. When I started, there was actually very few people who had any degrees in biomedical engineering or bioengineering. It's basically using engineering tools to ask a variety of different, even basic science questions, which I continue to do and which I did. Many of my colleagues have degrees in mathematics or physics or in chemistry or in biology, not necessarily engineering, but it is sort of applying the tools of engineering, the sort of constructing a system that allows us to ask those questions. So for example, in my case, I've always been interested in understanding how different things come together to create function of a cell, of a protein, of a larger system. And in many ways, that resembles how engines work or how machines work. Now, that is very much a question of engineering, but it's also the question of fundamental science as well. And I think one of the things that we have to understand is that at a certain point, these fields intersect. My PhD advisor's home department was biochemistry. His degrees were in physics. My other PhD advisor, so I had two advisors, Steve Berry was a thermodynamics person trying to understand heat, but he had used that to understand environmental science, and some of his work led to the environmental regulation laws in Chicago. I think the interdisciplinary nature of science is also remarkably exciting. And one has to have, of course, grounding, but I think the ability to really ask questions that fascinate you has always been something that I've cherished. I mean, in some ways, if somebody were to ask me, my career has been anything but a straight line. I mean, I've gone from problems that have been interesting from one to the other, but driven by fundamental curiosity in science. And also, of course, that comes with a lot of hard work that you just have to put in the effort.
Well, so I like what you said about, being very honest and open when you don't know something, to say, I don't know. And I think that's the hallmark of a true scientist. Because the more you know how much you don't know. And so you very easily can say, I don't know that. And that's an important lesson, I think, for everybody to say, I don't know this, but let's join hands and let's go find the answer. Let's explore. Which leads also, you mentioned how your career went from one discipline to another, and how that it's not the end of your life what you study in grad school or undergrad school. That's just a stepping stone on your path of discovery. And actually, from what you said, you create the new discipline, you create the new field, how your questions lead you. So in fact, you are a pioneer at the level of molecules, at the level of discovering nature, which is, to me, very, very exciting. So tell us more in your career of discovery, whether as in your graduate study or as a postdoc at MIT, or now when you have your own lab. Scientists fail more than they succeed. So how did that play out in your life?
So, if I were to put in the list of failures, both in terms of research and in some grants and papers rejected, ideas that didn't lead anywhere, I think I would have libraries full of that. I think I would have sort of basically, but that's how it is, So I think there are many failures. Some of them are because of your limited knowledge. Some of it because you are at the forefront and you have no idea what it's going to happen. Some of it is also because you were thinking of something and somebody else has already done it, and it's already figured out. So there are all kinds of things. I remember very clearly that when I started off in my graduate school, the question I was particularly interested in this case, it was understanding how proteins form a specific structure. The kinds of questions that I was interested in initially, I realized that they were already solved, which was interesting because it was in some ways a confirmation that I was thinking about right things, but also quite sad because I was all excited about something that somebody else had already figured out. So those were some kinds of questions. In postdoc, most of the experiments I tried on didn't work. First time, second time, 12th time, 18th time, the list is long. My computer simulations that I thought I knew at the back of my hand gave results that were nonsense. I remember sending my first paper for publication out of my postdoc, and the reviewer said that I need to go and revisit Newton's laws because I was so wrong. And that's one of the most cited papers that I have now because I had to go back and sort of explain myself very well. So you have all sorts of these stories where even when I thought I got it right, I actually didn't. So the lesson learned is, there are two lessons learned. One is that you have to have very thick skin, right? You have to be in it not because you want to impress others, but are in it because you really care. Because if your goal is to impress a person, X, that person may not care, or that person may never be impressed. And that's not how you should lead your life as a scientist. And the second answer is that you have to be humble. You have to realize that you are going to be wrong. So failure comes not because you didn't try hard enough, but you tried hard enough and you were just wrong. And that's also okay. And I think that sense of humility is also absolutely important. I don't take myself very seriously with my new ideas. My students tell me all the time, this is not workable. And oftentimes they're right, because they also know a lot. So I think that's part of the process. And the stories haven't ended. The stories still go on.
Well, that's amazing. So can you tell us a little bit about your scientific discoveries, and how they've led to changes in our everyday lives?
Yeah. So when I started off in my PhD, as I said, I was working on specific proteins and their structure. And one of the questions I was very interested in, this is the time, late 1990s and through 2003, I was very interested in understanding, can people predict what a structure of a particular protein would be? Now, that seems very esoteric, that seems very sort of far out there, but the function of every protein in your body depends on its structure, right? And the goal is, can you predict structure so that some proteins that have lost their structure, you can fix those. So some of the diseases, for example, Alzheimer's, you could sort of fix that protein and get functionality back. Or you could design certain proteins that could do certain things as therapeutics. So I was involved in sort of developing computer simulations for that process, because you cannot design all proteins in the lab. They're expensive. Things don't work. To be able to do that on the computer allows people all over the world to do that faster. So I was very, very sort of interested in that question. And some of the papers that we wrote described what are the limitations of computer modeling and what can you do better. In my PhD, again, looking at sort of this idea of modeling, in my postdoc rather, we were very interested. Okay, let's take a step back. Typically, the way people do experiments with cells, cancer cells in this case, was they would take cells, they would put on a glass slide and stick it under the microscope and see how cells respond to therapies, or how cells respond to sort of this drug or that drug. And that's very interesting. But you and I both know that by putting a cell on a glass slide does not represent or reflect what is happening in vivo. You and I are not made out of glass slides. We are not two-dimensional. There's a lot of complexity in the human body. It's tissue, and it's extracellular matrix, and it's not as stiff as glass, and it's not as straight as glass. So mine was the first computer model that sort of looked at what would happen if you were to put cells in a three-dimensional environment. Okay, so that was, and that again has something that has been cited over 1,000 times in the last 10 or 15 years. So that's something that I would say was an important contribution to the field in being able to understand how cells actually work in 3 dimensions. And that is important for us to understand how cancer cells move. I mean, one of the questions I was interested in is that if, God forbid, somebody has liver cancer, the cells metastasize from the liver to other parts of the body. The normal liver cell doesn't move anywhere, right? So what is it about cancer cells that allows it to move and really go to other parts of the body, which eventually leads to metastasis, which is the main reason why people die because of cancer. And sort of, again, these kinds of questions have been interesting. More recently, we've gotten interested in a question that is at the interface of science and engineering and public health. So in many parts of the world, including the country that I came from in Pakistan, one of the questions is, do the medicines that people get, are they of good quality or not? So you go to the pharmacy, you get an antibiotic, it might be fake. It might be substandard. Can we detect it? So can we come up with molecules or small sensors that can bind to the drug and give off a signal and tell whether this drug is pure or impure, saving lives of people who are vulnerable? And so we've been very interested in that thing, both from a modeling standpoint and also from experiment. And that's something that we've done in refugee camps. That's something that we've been working in different countries, and developing sort of that idea of how do you develop new molecules that can be used as a sensor. So it's sort of combining some of the work that I did many years ago about sort of structure of biological molecules, as well as sort of combining our more recent interests of impact on public health.
Wow, this is fascinating. We're going to take a break and then come back to continue this conversation and to learn more about more of your failures in your journey and more on how that has impacted how we live our lives as humans, and about your book and about antibacterial resistance. So we'll be back. Please stay with us.
Thank you.
A free online chat can give you the personalized tips you need to start boosting your retirement savings today.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Find out how to use an awkward silence to help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
So, Professor Zaman, can you share with us more about some of the failures you've had in the lab on your path of discovering how to utilize the proteins you were talking about and creating new molecules to detect, quality control for certain medications, as you mentioned, and then how that led you to write a book about your work?
So, the idea is there, and the idea itself is actually pretty solid. You can use molecules to detect whether the antibiotic or the aspirin that you're getting is real or fake, or is it counterfeit? Does it have the right quality standards? But in practice, it's actually quite hard because you need to be extremely precise, right? So, for example, if you are not binding very well, your molecule isn't binding, it can give off all kinds of signals, and you really have no idea whether to trust it or not. So the precision in that molecular design is important. There are other questions as well. For example, we thought of using RNA as a probe. Now, that sounds good, that would work very well in the lab, but RNA is actually quite unstable. So outside, very sort of precise and polished lab conditions, it would actually degrade quickly. So the entire system would fall down. We also had things that were giving signal binding to pretty much everything. So they were giving signal that as they bound to the drug, as well as they bound to the impurity, as well as they bound to the degradation product. Again, you have no idea whether it really works or not. We have also had all kinds of problems in designing these systems and their stability. So we know that if you're going to do this in the lab, well, that's fine. But if you're going to do this in the field, you may need to store these molecules for months on end. Our molecules were not sort of staying stable. After a day, they would start to degrade themselves. So all kinds of these challenges. Some are scientific. How do you design a molecule? Some are basically what I would call design issues of how do you sort of keep them stable. And some are actually practical when you take these things into the real world. You had asked earlier about implications of our work, and we hope that they will be, but they're real challenges that go beyond what you discover in the lab as you start to translate these things into the real world.
So my question: what keeps you going? I mean, you're failing in different parts repeatedly. What keeps you going?
So there are several things that keep me going. One is recognizing that we are on this for a bigger calling. In this case, we are very interested in this question of improving the lives of people, especially who may be vulnerable. We are interested in this because we think there is an issue of inequity that needs to be addressed. People should not get bad medicines anywhere in the world. So that's one. Two, I think being surrounded by good people who are motivated and sort of motivate you further. One of the things that I tell people is that science is not a solo sport, at least the science in my field. It's a team sport, and which means that it should not be basically about the glory of an individual, but sort of the success of the team. And the team here can be as large as you can imagine. And the third thing I think is taking a long-range view, knowing that this is how the process works, that success is rare, that success is difficult, and the end result is not the goal, but sort of the journey itself is rewarding. And so I would be dishonest if I said that I don't get frustrated or I don't get disappointed. That I think is not true. If anybody doesn't get disappointed, they are sort of superhuman beings. I do, but then you have to sort of realize that there is a lot of work to be done, and the reason you're doing it is not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And there are many challenges that you'll face on a day-to-day basis. COVID is just one of the long list of very difficult things that we have to deal with. I mean, we have issues, sometimes personal, sometimes professional, sometimes scientific, sometimes technical. And this is, I want to tell this to myself, to my students, and to our wonderful listeners that this is part of the challenge. And we have to realize it, and we have to recognize it. And it is not to be disappointed, but perhaps to recognize that when you're doing things that are hard, that are very difficult, this is what's going to happen. I mean, whether it is a man landing on the moon or sort of a discovery of a new drug, failure is a lot more common than success.
That's a very important point to keep in mind, because as you said, if you already plan into or build into your plan that there's going to be a failure, then it's okay. Then that's part of the journey. And actually, you would be surprised if it didn't happen. That would be wrong. Something is wrong. That would raise a red flag.
Absolutely. One of the things that I tell students is that I personally have learned a lot from my failures than from my successes. And my success may have been merited or just good fortune, but doing after the failure, it seems a lot more realistic and merited, because then you have figured out what doesn't work. And I think that is just as important as anything else. I think we undervalue failure in some ways as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, and I noted that some journals are coming out that document the failures, so which is also important, so others don't repeat the same experiment and then hit the same wall, because nobody's published that data or
Absolutely.
those failed questions. So that's an important point that you brought up.
Absolutely.
You also talked about the importance of teamwork and working together and testing ideas on each other and being critiqued by your peers. So how do you see COVID-19 and the inability to meet in conferences in person, has that affected you, or you found like kind of a silver lining in that?
It's hard to find silver lining when so many people around you are in a very difficult situation. But I think we have not had as much of an impact as some of my peers did. We've been very fortunate, alhamdulillah, to have a team that maintained some level of activity. We had to sort of implement, of course, various protocols and procedures. But in general, I think we have not had some of the challenges because our work was organized in a way that it allowed for the continuation. There have been some other challenges. A lot of our work has, in the last few years, focused on engagement with partners. As I mentioned, we're interested in sort of using some of these approaches that we have developed and translating them into real world solutions. That has been harder. We have not been able to travel. We are also cognizant that the places where we work are hit hard and continue to be hit hard. So that's another challenge as well. But in some ways, that has given us an opportunity to think and reflect on the importance of collaboration, on the importance of the impact of these things on people, and trying to put people at the center of our work and reflecting on that. So in some ways, I would say it has given us a chance to read a little bit more, to engage with us in meaningful ways, and value a lot of our, I would say, common bond and the stress that bond is under.
So is this what led you to write this book? Because this is a book for the general public. This is not a peer-reviewed journal. It's not a scientific book as a textbook that you would use in a classroom, but it's more for the raise awareness among the general public. So you want to tell us the story of why you wrote that book and the how it was received?
So, the book came out right at the start of the COVID, global COVID sort of outbreak. It came out in April of 2020, right when countries were starting to go on lockdown and shutdowns and things like that. I had not planned it that way, and I would say I wish that there was no coincidence of anything. And in part, I also recognize that the book came out when people were already worried and scared and had sort of the fatigue. So this sort of added perhaps a little bit more anxiety to people's lives, and that's not the intent either. I started working on it, Dr. Dajani, several years ago, as we started looking at this issue of substandard and counterfeit medicines, and we recognized one of the biggest group of substandard medicines is antibiotics. And that got us thinking about antibiotic resistance and sort of the disproportionate impact of that. I told you, this is where things perhaps come a full circle. I come from a family of historians, and I've always had this deep fascination with history as a tool to understand science as well, and questions in science. So I started asking myself how did we end up here? This notion of antibiotic resistance. This is not something that happened yesterday. We took a whole bunch of decisions and policies and behavior. So I started unpacking that. This is also at the same time when there was a global, I would say, lack of trust in science, partly driven by politics, certainly in the United States, but elsewhere as well. And I wanted to write a book that would sort of speak to my daughter and her science teacher in middle school, to my neighbor and somebody in my mosque and my cousins in Pakistan. I wanted to write in a way that was scientifically authentic, but also were to tell the story of the process. But most of all, I wanted to write it because I recognized that by understanding history of where we are, we basically have the keys of how to get ourselves out of it. In many ways, exactly doing or undoing the things that we have done, we can sort of do better. And this is one of the things that I said earlier about a sense of humility. I love science. I work in that discipline. This is my job. This is my livelihood. But I also want us to recognize that scientists have a role to play in society in collaboration with other disciplines, whether it is economists and bankers, politicians and lawyers, social scientists and public health professionals. And a more sort of high impact science would happen if we are part of the equation. There is no, just as in a research lab like mine, there is no sort of a solo player. Also, science itself should not be working as a solo player in society, and it will not be able to do much. It needs to work with sort of other institutions in society, globally and domestically, if it really needs to address some of the challenges. And I think we've seen that with COVID, that it is not just the issue of coming up with vaccine, it is also the distribution of that vaccine. It's also making sure that rich and poor people are able to get access to it. That we also recognize that just by making vaccine, you're not going to solve the problem completely. It has political, economic, social implications. And once you start to put those in place, then you can start to see sort of the end of this proverbial tunnel.
So that's a very important point you raise, that I would take home as, for me as a lesson, is that science has to be in every discipline somehow, as an underlying theme, because whether it's the data-driven kind of approach, whether it's the logical, critical approach of asking questions and critiquing the status quo, or even just raising general awareness to, if we understand how things work, we can actually develop better solutions. And so raising that bar for the general public, whatever role they play in the general public, whether it's a politician, it's a religious leader, or it's just a school teacher. And I think, as you said, COVID has driven that point home again and again and again. Well, that's amazing. Well, I encourage everybody to read your book, to make it part of their reading, and maybe read it aloud at home in the evening, once a week with your family. And to the importance of reading, which you also alluded to in the beginning of your career, how reading widened your imagination and broadened your horizons to know what's out there. And then tying it to history, the way you tied things all to history, and the importance of the humanities, in addition to the basic sciences. You need both to move forward. Yeah, please share about that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as reading is concerned, I tell people to read broadly and read well outside their discipline, because I think that's important for us to reflect on who we are as a people, on broadening our horizon. One of the things that I tell my students is that they also need to be able to write well, to be able to communicate well. Their ideas are important, but if they are unable to convey them in a way that somebody else can understand them, they will not be able to get sort of the necessary engagement that they're looking for. And to be able to write well, you have to read a lot. You have to read science and social science, poetry and literature, history and philosophy. And I think the other dimension which I tell people is that we as scientists or engineers or as sort of technologists have to know that we are also citizens of a society, of a local society and a global society. And that means that there are several ethical responsibilities. There's a lot of discussion these days about artificial intelligence. Is it ethically okay for you to develop technologies that can be used against a group of people? There's a lot of discussion about CRISPR and sort of the ethical implications of that. And they're not going to come from science alone. They're also going to come from learning about history, philosophy, about ethics. And we have to really know those, because the goal is not to really make something for the sake of making things, but the goal is for it to really make an improvement in the lives of the people. So that's something that is important. I mean, I think I was just discussing with my wife last night about sort of, I'm reading this book by Al-Ghazali, and sort of the importance of ethics and learning, and sort of how he centers it, or more recent sort of philosophical arguments about the purpose of science and its contribution to society. And that requires broad reading. I also think that scientists have to engage with social scientists and humanists, because there is a bidirectional traffic of ideas that needs to really make an impact on them. Again, I'll give an example of COVID. The fact that people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged have poor outcomes from COVID is not just because of lack of vaccines, but the underlying drivers of why is it that the healthcare system doesn't take care of them. right? So if you are going to just make vaccines, that gets you there to a certain point, but then there are bigger questions that we need to address in partnership with social scientists and policymakers and humanists to do that. So read broadly, read in any language that suits you. Doesn't have to be sort of the language, certainly in English or French or German, if it's Arabic, or if it's Urdu, or if it's Farsi. Read so that you're able to benefit from the wisdom of people who have thought. So I cannot emphasize this enough. I'll tell you a story. In my class, it's a very technical class that I teach in biomedical engineering. One of the homework assignments is for the students to write about any book that they have read that semester, and they get full credit. I don't ask them why they chose the book. They just have to say, well, this is the book that I read. In my other class, which is for broader audience, in the first 5 minutes, we have a book minute. So I talk about the books that I'm reading, or the students tell me what they're reading. And it's just sort of breaks the ice a little bit, tells you what they're reading. It sort of adds to the conversation. And they might all be scientists, they might all be biochemists or engineers or chemists, but sort of just notion of what reading is. I remember just in this last semester, because the course had a lot of mathematics, I asked my student, I mean, we often know or discuss that Newton had made tremendous contributions to calculus in terms of its creation and structure. Well, what about algebra? And they did not know that algebra comes from Al-Jabr wal-Muqabla, and the book was by Mohammad bin Musa al-Khwarizmi, and the word algorithm comes from that. And it was just fascinating for them to realize that these things came from a person. And we use the term algorithm all the time, or we use the word algebra all the time, but there's a person behind this. Who was he? What was he doing? Why did he do this? How was he thinking about it? Just fascinating conversations that I learned a lot from my students.
Well, that is so amazing. That's such a wonderful and important message that you just shared with us. The importance of reading, and that leads me to the importance of listening. And like you said, being humble to listen and learn from others. Even if I may be the best in my field, there's a whole other world that I know nothing of. And to keep that humility in mind so that we can listen to each other, engage in conversations, engage in sharing of ideas with the true, sincere goal and intention of seeking the truth, finding the truth to create a better life for everybody. And knowing, history, of course, without it, we are nothing. I mean, it develops who we are as an identity. And we need more writers like you to share and to write and so that we can learn from each other. So as we end this wonderful interview that I don't want to end because I'm enjoying it so much and learning so much, do you have some last piece of advice that you would like to share, whether teenagers or with parents or just the general public?
Well, look, I mean, this sounds like cliche, but I tell people to really follow their dreams. You know, I think that oftentimes, and I'm speaking because I'm an immigrant, I come from a society where there's a lot of emphasis on finding good, meaningful employment. And I think all of that is valuable. I don't want to disregard it. But I also want to say that if you are genuinely curious about something, the likelihood of you being very good at that is very high. And there is a demand for in the world, and will always be, for very good people in their disciplines. You could be a theoretical physicist looking at string theory. You could be a marine biologist. You could be a mathematician, or you could be sort of an analytical chemist. There is a need for you out there. And just because you cannot sort of see the path of what that final job is, doesn't matter. You can create those jobs, and people do this all the time. We are too often too scared because we don't have role models, and I understand that, right? You want to be like Uncle so-and-so and Aunt so-and-so because you've seen them. But you could also be that Uncle so-and-so and that sort of neighbor ABC or whatever. So I tell people that it is worthwhile to take the chance in their careers in the thing that they're passionate about. That's the first thing. The second thing is, we all make mistakes. And even in our careers, it's okay to start somewhere and then move in that. My own career, I started off as a theoretical chemist. I do very little theoretical chemistry, even though I use all the sort of the knowledge base of how to look at problems from there. I don't remember many of my formulas or things that I memorized when I was an undergrad, but what I do remember and will always remember is how do you construct and deconstruct a problem. And that's important for us to know. We don't need to sort of be sort of these memory machines. What we want to do is critical thinking abilities. And whether you end up sort of in an environmental science group or a sort of a policy domain or become sort of a clinical scientist, I think that is what we want to emphasize. And so and the last thing I tell people all the time is many of my mentors are people who I learned from, but many are people who died hundreds of years ago. And I sort of, from their books and from their writing, I feel that I'm connected and I sort of learn from them. I wish I could ask them questions, but I cannot. But that's okay. So find mentors who are around you, but also mentors you may never meet just because they're in a different land or they are no longer alive. And you'll find people through their writings and their work still guiding you. And you'll find someone out there who is going to sort of point in the direction where you'll find your personal, professional, and intellectual satisfaction.
That's amazing. And I think if we follow your advice on all three, we will be happier people.
Absolutely.
Right? And if we're happier, everybody around us will be happy. And this will create a better life for everyone all over.
Absolutely, inshallah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Zaman, for this wonderful conversation. And we hope people will go buy your book, Biography of Resistance. Please do, and then share your thoughts and ideas with Professor Zaman. And this is a call out for people to read and to write and explore your history and who you are. Thank you very, very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. And I remain open to conversations from all parts of the world. So I if you reach out, I'll do my best to respond.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being with us today. This was a fascinating conversation. Please come back next time. We are having an interview with a fascinating scientist. Her name is Shadia Habbad. She's at the University of Hawaii, and she's going to tell us all about the universe. And she focuses on the sun. She studies stars. So stay tuned. See you next time.